First thing I would say, if I'm thinking of like a cisgender person who has never had any interaction with any of these concepts, it's okay to take your time if you want to understand. Because I think that's important, because we could educate people as much as we want. And at the end of the day, if there's someone who just wants to be hateful or who does not want to understand, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? You know, if you're really trying to understand, if you want more information, like, it's okay to take your time with some of these concepts, because it can be really hard to wrap your brain around. You know, I didn't get there on day one either, you know, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
What do you really know about people who were born transgender? Have you ever met someone who's transgender? Well, if you're like me, you're curious but hesitant to ask questions. Well, welcome to Demystifying the Transgender Journey. In our conversations with people who were born transgender, their families, friends, and the professionals who support them, we ask probing questions and discover insightful and educational answers. You can also find more information on our website, thetransgenderjourney.com. Now let's get right into today's episode. Welcome to another episode of Demystifying the Transgender Journey. We are so glad you're here today, and you are going to be so glad you're here today. So this is a place where real stories and honest conversations and authentic voices come to life through our interviews with people who were born transgender, their family members, coworkers, friends, healthcare professionals, to people who are on the journey along with them. So I'm Lynn Murphy. I'm an author, speaker, leadership coach, and founder of Women Who Push the Limits. And I'm the cisgender half of your host team today. And joining me is the amazing Wendy Cole, an affirmed woman who is a transition mentor, very insightful coach, and living proof that it's never too late to embrace your true self, because she transitioned at age 67 and now helps other people navigate life's biggest challenges. She's been through some and is navigating them very well. And we're pleased always to bring you conversations that open minds, touch hearts, and inspire change. So share these stories out. We want to make this available to a larger audience, so your help in sharing it is much appreciated. Now, for today's guest, this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time. Our guest, Wolfie Lopez, brings a rare combination of professional training, lived experience, and a deep compassion to conversations about gender, sexuality, and identity. They're a social worker trained as a therapist with a master's degree in social work from University of Michigan and more than a decade of experience in crisis intervention. Much of it, in fact, most of it, working with LGBTQ young people at some of the most vulnerable times in their lives. But Wolfie's insight doesn't just come from the textbooks or clinical work. You know, they identify as non-binary and queer, and they speak candidly about what it means to grow up questioning gender, navigating identity outside the binary, the box that we all try and put people in, and finding language and community that finally started to feel like home. So I'm so grateful for this conversation and so glad that you're here, and can't be more delighted to introduce Nicole Wolfie Lopez. Thank you.
Hey, hi, everybody.
So thanks for joining us today, Wolfie. You know, we want to talk about your personal story and then get into your professional story, because one influences the other, and you've got such an amazing, fascinating story. So start with your personal story a little bit. Give us a little insight into what it was like growing up.
Yeah, I'd like to start in high school when I realized it was like a culmination of a lot of different things, but I realized that I didn't view my gender or sexuality like other people did. And I had access to the internet. I grew up in the 90s, so the internet was something I had been familiar with and grown up with. And when I looked online, I found this whole new vocabulary for transgender experiences, for queer experiences. And I think that that really opened my eyes, because it gave me the language that I needed to articulate what I was experiencing inside. I had spent the majority of my young life feeling that I was different than other kids that I interacted with. I'd been homeschooled most of my life, and then I went to a private Baptist school where I wasn't really interested in playing with the other girls, but I was very interested in playing with the other boys. And so I think I kind of understood then that my my way of being in the world was different than a typical cisgender woman's way of being in the world. And I think that my mom thought of me as a tomboy. And I do think to a certain extent that that could be true. But I think as I got older, I conceptualized my own gender as something more than just that. There was something deeper than just, oh, I'm a cisgender girl who likes to wear baggy clothes, or that's kind of what I think of when I think about tomboy. Yeah. And so I think when I was in high school, I was like, oh, well, maybe I'm just a man. And that's what I've been my whole life. And so I was like, really resonated with that identity. Gosh, there's so many things that are coming to my mind now. Like, um, when I was in college, I was prescribed Spiro for some of my polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms. And that made me very upset because I was like, I really don't feel like I'm a woman, because I had found out that Spiro is a common hormone replacement therapy that's given to transgender women.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like very upset by this. My sophomore year of college, I went to Japan, and that was a very life-changing experience. Like, I was on my own in a foreign country. I could speak the language enough to get around and navigate and stuff. I was a student there, so I was taking classes. Coming from Kansas, I had never been around so many people in my life. I think it was then when I realized, like, I shouldn't care so much about how other people are perceiving of me, because there are all these people around me and they don't really care what I'm doing. They could care less. Everyone's living their own life. And it was through being in Japan, it was through like finding myself there, that I was like, I think I'm something. I'm not quite a trans man, but I'm not a cisgender woman either. And so it was only, I think, during slash after this experience that I found the word non-binary, and I was like, that's it. That's it right there. I'm somewhere in the middle. I feel more like a gender rebel sometimes, or gender queer, or gender fluid, than I do tied to any sort of gender all the time.
Did you have any representation of someone who is non-binary? Did you just read something about it, or how did you define non-binary in your own mind?
So I believe I had read about it in probably one of my classes in college or something. I can't exactly remember. But Lynn, as you asked me that question, I couldn't help but think like, okay, so like when I was in high school, I was super into this subgenre of Japanese music called visual kei, where it's kind of like hair metal, but more androgynous. Lots of thin men in makeup, and you can't really quite tell if they're a boy or a girl. You're like, I don't know, but I like it. At least for me, I was like, okay, I feel very drawn and attracted to this aesthetic of in between. And then, yeah, in college, as I read more and more, and I got more interested in other cultures, like my first BA was in Japanese language and literature. I ended up doing more research into like how other cultures view gender and sexuality as well. And so I think that was also like oh, there's more than just this American Eurocentric view of the world of how gender ought to be. There's more than that. And so I think all those experiences kind of, I couldn't pinpoint exactly when I found out about the word non-binary, but I remember that there was this milieu of things where I said, like, I feel more like that than anything else.
So all of a sudden, the universe was sending you these things, and you putting them all together and recognize that that's what you identify as.
And I think I was driven by my own curiosity about
Mm.
other people, about the world, about like, wow, not everybody views the world the same way that I do. And that's amazing. And I want to know more about it. And I
Mhm.
feel that I've always been driven that way.
That's a strong characteristic to have.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
it led to me, when I got my second BA in psychology, I also got a minor in human sexuality. And so I was very interested in just human sexuality in general, which also includes gender, or at least it did in my curriculum.
So we've been talking about non-binary and some of these other terms, but take a minute, Wolfie, and explain those for our audience so we're all on the same page. We're not confusing people about what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of always like to add a little disclaimer whenever I'm explaining this or whenever I'm defining it, in that for every person, it's going to be a little bit different. And so I am not the arbiter of what is or is not non-binary. This is my definition. This is what I've gathered of talking to other non-binary people about their own experiences, but it's not the end-all be-all definition.
Right. And because gender is a spectrum, continuum, everybody's experience is going to be different.
Right.
Across the entire community.
And I think there are as many like cisgender definitions as there are people who experience that gender, right? Like it's not going to be the same for every person. And I almost think there's as many genders as there are people, just because everyone's experience and interaction with the world is going to be different.
No one is absolutely male or female.
Yep. And what that male or female means when it comes to gender is going to be different, like what it means to be masculine or feminine. So having said that, when I think of non-binary, I think of, what do we mean by binary? We mean the binary of genders, okay? We mean the male and female, masculine, feminine, these sorts of energies. So someone who is non-binary, it feels on some level or in some ways that they don't fit neatly into either categories, or that they don't resonate with either category. So they exist somewhere in between. Now, what that in between can look like can vary a lot. It can be someone who presents very femme and is assigned male at birth, who likes having a beard, which is, we think of a typically masculine thing, and also likes to wear skirts, which we think of a very feminine thing. It could be literally any combination. It's almost hard to come up with examples. It could be someone like me. Like the way I think of my own non-binary experience is that, like, I have a lot of masculine traits that I really love and I think are great. And I also have a lot of feminine traits I think are great and I love. But I don't fit into either masculine or feminine roles. And so I feel like in a way I almost reject them in place of my own third version, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've always looked at it as cisgender people, as you brought up, it's a preponderance toward one side or the other. For someone like me, assigned male at birth, I always felt completely female. And we're born that way. And our gender is formed in utero for us personally. And so that's what you've gone through as well. And you've made it your own. And I've seen so many people in the community do that.
So do you go some days masculine, some days more feminine, some days more androgynous? How do you like to present?
Well, I think I veer towards more femme just because I feel more comfortable that way in my presentation.
Is that because of social reasons?
I think partially societal and also partially because I live in a fat body and I think that is inherently read as femme. And so sometimes I think it's easier for me to just do that. Now, sometimes I just like wearing dresses, sometimes it is just like, oh, I've got this cute dress. I really just want to wear it. I'm going to put on makeup, even though I rarely put on makeup. But, sometimes I do really feel the femme spirit move within me, I guess you could say. But, if I'm at work or if I'm just like doing like stuff around the house, like fixing stuff or just existing, sweatshirt like I'm wearing today is great. I think I do typically just dress in a Midwestern fashion. So just like jeans and a t-shirt is fine for me most days.
And do you wear your hair long and down like you've got it today?
No, I
Did you pull
usually
it
put
up?
it up in a clip, but I just couldn't find my clip. But that's because I don't like the feeling of my hair on the back of my neck all the time. So,
But that has nothing to do with how you're feeling that day necessarily.
well, I mean, I suspect it has to do with my amount of neurospiciness. So sometimes I think it has more to do with the sensation than anything else. But
Interesting. Well, and one thing we haven't said for our audience is that you were assigned female at birth, right?
yep.
So just so they're clear on who it is we're talking with today. So assigned female at birth, identify as non-binary. So talk to us about what it's like for someone who's questioning and experimenting with gender to go through puberty and early adulthood, with all the hormones and the romantic things and that kind of thing. What was that like for you as you were trying to identify who you really were?
I find that question very hard to answer because I don't quite remember exactly, because I feel like a lot of my early puberty experience were built around, although I think it's interrelated, not necessarily my gender experience, but my experience with getting a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome. I had very sporadic, unpredictable, very heavy menstrual cycles, which led to me having to get a lot of tests. And my test results came back with like elevated testosterone levels.
Mm.
And so that can be a symptom, is the hormone imbalance of you have cysts that grow on your ovaries or something going on with your hormones. I know when I have talked with clients in the past, particularly about getting on hormones and like, what they can expect and things like that, which as a medical professional who like doesn't prescribe the hormones myself, I was familiar generally, but also there's always that like, well, you don't really know what it's going to do. So how do we find freedom in that? And how do we navigate that in a way that we want to, that's in line with who we are? Because we can't necessarily avoid like, negative mood swings or things like that, because that's just the hormones doing their thing and leveling out.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of that going on there. I mean, the teenage years and early adulthood are hard enough no matter what gender you are, I think, no matter what hormones are running through your body.
Yeah.
It's life or death most of the time, I think.
Yeah.
Not literally, but
Yeah, it feels that way. And it's interesting because when I went to the public high school, I have no memories of being bullied in the public high school. And so honestly, I just think I was so curious about other people that I don't know. I was probably just as emotional as my peers, but I don't know.
So just to go back a minute for the bullying when you were young, was that just because you were acting more masculine or doing things that boys did but girls didn't? Was it that
I,
kind of bullying, or did people think you were thinking something about your sexual preferences or anything like that?
I don't really think it was so much about like any sort of sexual preferences or anything, but I did get bullied a lot during that time too, because of like I got my period faster than
Oh
everybody,
yeah,
and
yeah.
my breasts developed faster than everybody. I suspect it's because of the PCOS, although I'm not 100% sure on that, but because I suddenly had a growth spurt.
Yeah.
And that makes you different with all your peers. And as a result,
Yes. And it's been a long journey for me to accept what my body is now. And when I say acceptance, I think this opens up another conversation of like body positivity and such. But I find that my feelings fluctuate too much for me to force myself to love myself all the time, because I can love ice cream one day and then not care for it the next day. It doesn't mean anything about me that I don't constantly love something. And since a young age, I felt that my body is not my own. There's some sort of body horror about like my body is doing a thing I didn't know that it could do.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
now
here are the results of that. And so there's at times very dysphoric disconnection of, this is not the body that I would necessarily envision myself in, but it's the body I have. And so there needs to be some acceptance so that I can not hate myself all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Self-acceptance is huge
Yes.
for all of us. Without that, nothing works.
Yes.
So at any time when you were thinking all these things about your body and about being bullied or not, did you at that point in your life understand the word transgender? And did you ever think of transitioning? Did you ever feel like you wanted to be more in a man's body?
So I became aware of terminology for like transgender, or like, you know, the transgender experience, I guess we can call it loosely, with like, you know, surgeries and HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and things like that when I was in high school. So that's more when I found out about that. And I think before that, I just was very confused about what was going on and felt like there was something not wrong, but like that I couldn't articulate something that was deep inside me.
Mm-hmm.
So then when I found out about like these terminology, you know, transgender, et cetera, so on and so forth, I did think about like transitioning. I did think about like, oh, you know, when I graduate and go to college, I could get hormone replacement therapy. I could get surgery. You know, these are things that I could do. That was a consideration that I had. And actually, it was really funny because I did have a trans mask friend in my life at the time who said that he was jealous of my voice because my voice was so much deeper than his. And so I do think that, you know, I did like that about myself, is that I have a deep voice, you know. I feel like this voice is very me. But yes, I did consider it for a while. But then like after I became more educated about like non-binary experience, I was like, okay, you know, is this something that I really want? Or is this just like something that I saw and I thought, you know, and, you know, not that I didn't, because I truly think I identified as a trans man. You know what I mean? Like I was having that experience, I was living that, and I was experimenting with pronouns, right? Especially in the beginning of college, just to see what fit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I needed that time and space to explore freely with my friends, where I could say for myself, I thought about it. Non-binary resonates with me. They, them resonates with me. I don't need a hormone replacement therapy. I'm fine with what I got. Potentially elevated testosterone levels and all. I already got that in some ways, I guess. And
you didn't need the HRT?
I guess not. And I'm okay with not getting surgery. I kind of like this in between weirdo space, you know, so it's kind of where I settled.
Good
Well,
for you.
Sounds like you're comfortable with that.
I'm very comfortable with that.
And that leads to self-acceptance and eventually self-love.
Yeah, this isn't everyone's experience, but, you know, I wish that people felt like they had that time to kind of be like, what is it that I really want to do? Because I think everybody needs time to explore their identity. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a very normal part of our developmental process growing up. You know, who are we? What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to exist with other people?
Sadly, it hasn't always been that way.
Right. Right.
The last century was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, people just identifying or sorting out what kind of clothes they like to wear. You know, are they the
right,
you know, Little House on the Prairie, or are they the Cher, or you know what? And going through that, and you hear people who are criticizing people who transition by saying they're just going through a phase, or if they're young people, if they're prepubescent, if they're adolescents, it's just a phase. They'll get out of it, but they don't want to give them time to do that experimentation.
Right.
or the love and honor, the grace to do that
And that's
experimentation.
because they don't understand we're born this way.
Mm-hmm.
But still, what you're saying, Wolfie, is that you had to figure out how it is you were born and where you fit in this huge spectrum, and to have time. And you're talking about experimenting, doing that in college. It's not
Right.
someone who's 15 years old and, that for whatever reason, their parents think, oh, it's just a phase. We're going to not pay any attention to it, kind of thing. Not change names.
College is the perfect place to experiment with that.
Yes.
I tried the transition at the end of college. It was a disaster, of course, but we won't go there.
Well, so you were in college. How did you get into the social work and the therapy?
I got into crisis intervention in the spring of 2014 when I volunteered for Headquarters Counseling Center here in Lawrence, Kansas. But at the time, it was the center here that answered the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline for the entire state of Kansas. So I was trained on how to intervene on the phone when people called in with crisis, any kind of crisis. It was a wide range of crises that I dealt with on the phone. And then I was like, as grim as it is, I was like, I think I'm pretty good at this crisis thing, actually. I had already been in like a psychology degree at that point. And I was like, I should really give this a go. So I stayed at headquarters for quite some time. I did training there. I answered the phones for a while. I answered the phone, I think, like a year and a half. And then I started working at the community mental health center. Then it's like, and then I did this, and then I did this. But you get the idea. That's kind of how I got into it, was being a phone counselor for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
And you ended up specializing in young people who were LGBTQ community members, right?
Well, I mostly, when I was a therapist, I worked with adults. Not that I don't think I would work well with kids. I just always found the prospect of working with the parents being intimidating. And so that was not really something I was just not interested in professionally. So I mostly worked with adults. Like, I think my oldest person I worked with was like 50 something. And then the youngest was 20 something.
Okay. So,
yeah, wide range. A lot in the middle, but yeah, wide range.
And then did it just kind of organically end up with the LGBTQ community, or was that from your interests, or how did that evolve?
Well, it was my interest because I knew how hard it was to find a professional who, as you were saying, Wendy, earlier, I knew how hard it was to find a professional that had experience or cared about my experience in a way that I knew that they knew what they were talking about. Like, I didn't feel like I had to have kitty gloves on with them. I could just tell them honestly how I felt. And I thought I would like to be that kind of therapist for someone who, they can see me, and I would advertise myself that way as being queer and non-binary, and working with these special and stigmatized sexualities, sexual minorities, even though I hate those words. I think it's what's widely used in the literature, but I advertise myself as someone who worked with queer, trans, LGBTQ plus, polyamorous folks, non-monogamous folks, kinky folks,
the whole spectrum.
The whole spectrum.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like you were non-judgmental too. So, besides your onto experimentation and your gender, you weren't looking at them with critical eyes, and I'm sure you were a great therapist to a lot of those people.
Thank you. I really think that part of that is just, again, I've always been curious about other people's experiences. And I think that's something that they can't teach you in grad school, is putting whatever your own definition is of a thing aside so that you can let the other person talk. Because like, I may conceive of something in a certain way, but I also have to be open to that I'm not right.
Especially for that person.
Yes, especially for that person. Agreeing on definitions, while important, is not, I don't have to say, oh, but my definition of non-binary is blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. What matters is that person's experience.
And their feelings.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm sure that helped you relate to your clients and help them relate to you.
I think my curiosity is really my strength in that regard.
Yeah.
And being able to tell people what you think of their experience to help guide them through it.
Mm-hmm.
Being open with them, which
Right.
is not necessarily part of the therapeutic process.
Right.
And what's your experience working with you as far as them finding representation and information so that they can, like you did, you said in the 90s, so that they can kind of start thinking about what this whole thing is all about?
I think that it's interesting because there's so much more information now, although I did work with quite a few people who were the same age as me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I worked with folks who also grew up in the same, the internet. Ooh, that's a thing. You can find information anywhere and everywhere. And I also think that with media nowadays, there is more queer representation. And so I think that that is good, that people can see themselves in some way in media that they consume.
Do you think it's less stigmatized because of all the information and representation?
Well, see, I think that that's tricky because I think we live in a political context that's very reactionary. And so I think that in some ways, yes, because I think that there's more general understanding. And in a lot of ways, no. Like it's both. And Wendy, you could probably speak to this, better than I could, but that I think that trans women in particular are very scapegoated and very
our culture is pushing back like crazy.
Yes.
Because the culture is essentially wrong and has been for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
They force the binary, and anyone assigned male that does what I did is obviously a very sick person in their viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
That's the culture pushing back. That's the purpose of what we're doing here today, is trying to put information out to counteract that culture.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me too, part of it is my own reaction sometimes, but people look at someone that they think they have to identify them in a binary box. That person's male, that person's female. And if they're androgynous, the cisgendered person head explodes because they can't figure out what this is. And it seems like there's a lot of that going on. What do you tell people about that kind of thinking?
And the other thing is everybody thinks that sex and gender are synonymous.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, otherwise intelligent business professionals and all of that.
Yeah.
It's synonymous.
Yes. Yes.
But it's not.
And it's not. It's not.
As I always say, gender's between the ears, sex is between the legs.
Yep. Yep. And I think that that's what is great about the era that we're in, is that there's so much in certain spaces, there's more understanding of how sex, gender, and sexuality are different, and even romantic attraction. Yes. And even like, how many people do you want to be in a relationship with? Like that, called relationship orientation, right? There's more ways of understanding with language how it is that we navigate the world, which is cool. But again, it's like that depends on having communities around you that can support you and have those conversations, because I think the wider reality right now is almost too dangerous to have those conversations right now.
So we're trying to educate people. So I'm asking for your help in how we can educate cisgender people. So when we hear these people, even me, once in a while, I'll look at somebody and go, I wonder if that person's transgenders now, especially because it's top of mind for me. But, if people are looking around and going, oh, what is that person? What do you say to them? How do they think about that?
I think the first thing that I would say or to ask is, well, it's hard to pick a first thing. Okay, top two things. First thing I would say if I'm thinking of like a cisgender person who has never had any interaction with any of these concepts, it's okay to take your time if you want to understand. Because I think that's important, because we could educate people as much as we want. And at the end of the day, if there's someone who just wants to be hateful or who does not want to understand, that there's not enough, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? Like,
yeah.
And so I think it's important to say, hey, you know, if you're really trying to understand, if you want more information, it's okay to take your time with some of these concepts, because it can be really hard to wrap your brain around. You know, I didn't get there on day one either, you know, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. And then also I would probably ask, like, why is it important that you know? Because I think that that's a good question to start with, because to me it kind of implies, like, you know, what does it
matter?
What does it matter?
Yeah.
And you know,
I think that's the main point to get across to people is, doesn't matter, does it?
No.
And from my first week of living authentically, I found out even my gay neighbors did not grasp this. And so I came to the conclusion that I don't expect any cisgender person to understand.
Right.
Comprehend is what I go for, and shifting their perspectives so that they can begin to at least accept some of this. That would be a major breakthrough in this society and this culture.
And Wendy, I love the way that you break down the difference between understand and comprehend, right? Because when I think understand, I think, well, I can never quite understand another non-binary person's experience. Nonetheless, somebody else entirely, like, there is always that gap between us and the other person where there's always unknowable parts, right? But can I at least understand what this person's perspective is? Or can I at least treat them like a human?
Exactly.
You know, like,
we're all human.
Yeah, we're all human. And if you are in curiosity, you are looking for the humanity in another person, and it doesn't necessarily matter gender or sex, because you're looking for commonality.
Well, even all my gay friends had problems understanding the spectrum of people and the differences that they see within the transgender community, from non-binary all the way through to the transsexual part of the community and the cross-dressing community and all of that. It just was totally foreign to so many people, even in the gay community. We're all just human. And so even when I look at somebody and their idea of presentation and the way they live as a transgender person is different from me, but that's okay. That's the beauty of the community.
Yes.
And variations in nature is not absolute on anything.
No.
That's how evolution occurs. And so there's always variations.
Yes.
So let's take a curious person who, you know, is genuinely interested, cisgender, know very little about this, hear all this goofy stuff on the radio and TV. What would you suggest? You know, give them some guidance for the cisgender person, how to ask questions or how to approach someone, not from a standpoint of judgment, but from a standpoint of what you're saying, the curiosity. What's your advice on how someone approaches someone? Because I know not everyone is as open as Wendy is, or you are, or our guests. They don't want to talk about it. Others are happy to talk about it. Others are reluctant, but willing to do it anyway.
You know, to be honest, with social media the way that it is, I'm sure that there are ways of finding queer educators online. Look for the people who want to educate. Or do you have a really close friend who you feel like you could just say, hey, I have questions. Are you willing to answer? And to be able to take a no, you know, that would be my advice, I suppose, is either find an educator who the community respects, or if you have a close friend who is trans or queer or what have you, it might even be a tough conversation to say, hey, I have some questions about some concepts. Would you be willing to answer some of my questions? And then if they say no, to be able to say, oh, okay, I totally get that, and not to ask.
And not be judgmental.
And not be judgmental. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And not be judgmental in the process.
Yeah. And look elsewhere, but maintain that curiosity.
Yeah. And I think that that's a good role that educators can play, because when you're an educator, it's like you're saying, okay, here are the concepts. Here is the generally understood things. And they're trained to give that information out.
When I started talking with cisgender people, I would always say I was born transgender. And when we got to that point where I would say, I'm an open book, ask me anything you want to, and absolutely nothing's off limits. And I'd also occasionally add, and don't worry about your phraseology, just ask. If it's potentially insulting or traumatic for another person, I'll tell you and correct you.
But it's so important to have these conversations and to find the people who are interested. People don't have to go to a workshop and be seen in person as being curious about something. Now they can do it on social media in their basements and look at it all day long and not worry about somebody thinking that there's something wrong with them.
And I've always been open to jumping on a Zoom conversation with someone who's curious.
Well, and with all the stuff that's going on now, we're hearing things that are false. One of the topics that is so false that we hear about is people who are detransitioning.
Oh, God.
Have you had any experience with clients? Is there anything you can share with us?
There's not anything that I can share specifically, I don't think. But I do say it's that sort of thing is why I feel at times hesitant to say, like, yeah, I thought maybe I was a trans man for a long time, because I don't feel like I detransitioned. It feels like I just evolved and became more of who I was.
Who you've always been.
And I've always been. And I don't really spend much time listening to detransitioners or their stories. So I don't really know much.
You didn't have clients that were at that point or came to discuss that? Okay.
No, I had clients who wanted to have someone to talk to through HRT. I had clients who decided they wanted top surgery, and we would talk about, what that might mean. And at the time I was in Michigan, and so there was a gender clinic attached to the University of Michigan hospital. And so we would make a recovery plan of, like, if you have top surgery, you can't really move your upper body because you have all those stitches that are healing. And, like, okay, so who's going to be on your team to help you through the recovery? Like, are we going to still do therapy throughout? These kinds of practical questions. I had clients who maybe were questioning of their gender identity or wanted to know more about gender and sexuality, but I don't know that I would say that being curious is the same as being a detransitioner. Again, I don't know much about what the terminology is. I have my impression of what it means, but I don't really know.
I'm sure in the mental health, you were first working in college, the suicide prevention line. Did you get a lot of that in your practice?
A lot of
people who were suicidal.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of people who are suicidal.
And so give us any insight into that, what we can do to help people at that point, or
so
keep from getting there.
It never hurts to take, if you really are curious and want to, you can take what's called mental health first aid, which is kind of like a very small, like, crisis intervention training for, like, how do you connect someone with other resources and that kind of thing. So you can take a mental health first aid training yourself. It's not necessarily like the intense, like when I was at headquarters, I did like 100+ hours of suicide and crisis intervention and prevention training. So it's not quite that intense, because that was a very intensive, in-depth training, but it could be a good starting point. And I also think, and this is something that can be really hard for folks, but, like, it can be just as simple as, like, respecting other people's pronouns. Pronouns are so important to our community. And, I think it's one thing for people to make a mistake. I know for me, it's like, hey, you know what? I'm not perfect. I mess up on other people's pronouns all the time. You know, it's a thing. And whenever that happens, I just say, oh, sorry. I correct my pronoun usage and then I move on. And it's identifying that you've made a mistake, apologizing for it, and moving on. And there are so many people who just say, oh, the pronoun thing is too hard. And in particular, with the clients I saw and people I've heard from, like on the crisis line, that is especially damaging when it's parents who are doing this. Parents who are on purpose not respecting someone's pronouns or accepting. Yeah. That they just use the wrong pronoun. They basically say, oh, well, I don't believe in that, or whatever their logic is. But that creates an unsafe environment and an invalidating environment for the child, which then can lead to suicidal ideation and self-harm ideation, lots of different issues. For something as simple as accepting another person's pronouns.
Yeah.
At least to me, it's simple. I don't know.
I always suggest to cisgender people, if they're not sure and they don't want to ask, use the person's name.
Yes, that's a good one.
Not a pronoun.
Yep.
But that would be especially hard for someone who feel like they're being rejected because they're dead naming them or not using the correct pronouns or something like that.
Family has to transition with you. If they don't, it won't work.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of therapists don't know how to work with people like us.
It's true.
They don't know what the standards of care are. They don't know what WPATH is. And that's potentially detrimental. I've had clients who have been with the same therapist as long as 4 years or so and made zero progress moving forward in their transition because they're not getting the right help. Standard therapy in that form without guidance doesn't work out. They have to deconstruct their male or female socialization in order to move into where they're comfortable.
Right. And I think with therapy, there's so much to talk about there, right? Like with the professional training. And when I have worked with other therapists, I think one thing that joins all therapists is that they want to help.
Yeah.
And I think it can be hard for some therapists to say, oh, actually, I should be really selective with the population I work with so that I can provide the best help that I can. And I feel that desire to help turns into, oh, well, I can work with anybody. It's not that someone isn't an ally or isn't, they may be queer themselves and just not want to work with a queer population. I don't know. But I do think that there is something to be said of, you can have things where someone isn't getting the help that they need because they haven't had the opportunity to find a mental health professional that really matches with them. And not to mention that in some areas, and I do think it is kind of everywhere, really, that there is a shortage of therapists and there's a shortage of accessibility, like, insurance. It's a whole can of worms, it's all. Bleh.
Until 2012, we were considered psychological, no treatment, no cure, and not recognized by the medical community or the therapeutic community. So 2012 to now is 13 years. That's all that we've had. They didn't even teach this that much in the schools.
Yep.
And we've come a long way, and there are things that look like we're turning back a little bit, but we'll keep hope alive, right?
Well, because of our social media and communication capabilities, they won't succeed in pushing us back.
I think it can be frustrating when it's like it's only been 13 years because we know how much further we could have gone if things had been different.
Right. The gay community lost their diagnosis of psychological no treatment, no cure in 1973. It took us almost 45 years later.
Yeah.
And that's because of the culture and the society.
So we'll take a step back and then start moving forward again, huh? Fingers crossed.
And more people like me are going to be out there talking about it with everybody.
Well, Wolfie, let's dig into a little more of you. So I'm wondering, when When you think about your whole life to this point, and you're still quite young, but what surprises you about your life?
I think what surprises me about my life, I don't know. I feel like in a way almost I'm not very surprised because given my material conditions, I don't see my life could have turned any other way. Like I was born in a certain time where I had access to more information than a lot of people who came before me. That's a material condition. You know, I had access to the internet, I had access to information, and you know, I had access to a certain social group. I don't know, in a way, when I look back on my life, I think it makes a lot of sense that things turned out the way that they did versus surprises.
What about your parents? We didn't talk about parents.
Oh, that's
Are
right.
accepting or not accepting, or how did
Yeah,
that
you
play
know,
in?
honestly, yeah, I guess that could be a surprise is that, you know, I was raised a certain way where I was taught that, you know, being gay was not accepted. And at the end of, I think it was like the end of high school, beginning of college, when I kind of came out to my mom about being bisexual, I think that she understood. Like I thought something really bad was going to happen. You know, I'd be kicked out and, you know, how am I going to make it work? You know, that kind of thing. But I think my mom cared more about me than she did. I think my mom is a very loving person, first and foremost, and is curious about other people like me. And so I think, I mean, I think that's where I got my curiosity from, is my mom. And so I think when she heard that, I think at first she was probably very shocked and surprised. And when she had time to think about it, she was like, well, I better find out more about this so that I can know more. And I think a lot of people aren't willing to do that, you know, and my mom was willing to learn more. And I know when I was like in college and high school, I was not the best teacher myself because I didn't know how to really talk about these concepts. So my mom found other people, other LGBTQ folks that she could talk to and ask questions. And, you know, it didn't have that tension of, you know, me being her daughter. And so I think that she did a lot of like growing on her own and her own understanding of, first of all, her faith. And at some point she made a decision to do that, right? She made a decision to be curious and to go find people to have these discussions with. And now my mom and I are closer than we've ever been.
Good.
You know, that's not how it turns out for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Exactly.
If there are cisgender people who are genuinely curious, I think it's important first to put into perspective of we must approach this with a curious demeanor. So,
well,
yeah.
I've seen you with your mother, and I can tell
she's great.
She's so proud of you, and she's so loving and such a wonderful woman. I just loved her the minute I met her. So
I know she's great, but in a way, it's like it made sense that I doubted that, you know, my mom would be supportive and turn out that way, but also like in a way it makes sense, like how could my mom have done anything else because she loved me so much.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You know, so many parents we hear about that,
Exactly.
they're worried about, you know, how are people going to look at them and not worried
Right.
about their kid. Yeah, so that's great. So what's your driving force? What keeps you going? You've been through a lot. You've had a lot of changes.
Yeah, I've had a lot of changes in my life. You know, I genuinely think that my driving force has always been and will just be curiosity about the interconnectedness of the world and the curiosity of what makes us us. You know, part of what I'm doing now is I'm really exploring my art. I've had a few like art shows, and I really use my art to explore connections, like connections between each other, connections with me and the divine. You know, what does it mean to be connected with something outside of us? I think that that's something that still drives me, is my curiosity about the world.
Wolfie, how did you come up with your name, Wolfie?
So when I was younger, I went to this like private Christian school, and I went there for third grade, and I didn't really, I had no desire to play with the other girls. I only really wanted to play with the boys and hang out with the boys. And I was bullied for that. And one of the ways I was bullied for that was that I was called the lone wolf. And, you know, at the time, it felt kind of odd. I was like, okay, like that's strange, whatever. And then when I was in high school and I went to a public high school, I was telling a friend about this one day, and my friend was like, oh, well, actually, I think I want to just call you Wolfie. And I said, I like that. You know, I like that name. And I think it's stuck with me ever since. And it kind of became like a thing that I was given in a hateful way. And then it became like a very loving gift from someone else of, you know, I think you're more of a Wolfie. Like, okay, yeah. And so then I just
embraced it.
I embraced it. I embraced it. So
good for you.
An amazing thing to do, to be able to change that lead into gold.
And
We're talking about a little alchemy here.
There are people I've known for years who, when they hear my government name, they're like, you're just Wolfie. Like, that doesn't even make sense to me. You know, like, how do you have another name? Or like, you know, folks I've known for years who like didn't even know I had another name.
Did you ever think of doing a legal name change?
I have thought about doing a legal name change. If I decided to do it, I probably would just change my name to Wolfgang, actually. And so then that way people will be like, because that's what I get the most is like, so is your name Wolfgang? And I want to, and I'm like, what if I could say yes? Like, what if I could say, yeah, my name's Wolfgang? Like, what?
Cool.
So anyway, yeah, I've thought about that.
Because names are very personal and also go along with how you identify.
Yes, they are very personal. I love nicknames. I just realized how much I grew up in a family of nicknames. Like, you know, call mom. I've always called my brother. My mom and my brother have always called me sissy. You know, that there are certain aunts who I don't know their legal names because they have nicknames. I just have grown up in a family where that was acceptable to just have names that aren't necessarily, you know, on your ID.
Well, and it doesn't have anything to do with gender, does it?
No.
It's who you identify as. That's really cool. So what would you like to say to the audience? What would you like them to know about being queer, being non-binary, being transgender?
That there is joy in it.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
There is joy in the discovery, in the exploration. I think especially in our current political environment, you know, which we've talked about, that it's easy to get very depressed. And that's for good reason, right? Like, it's for good reason that we feel depressed and anxious, or we can feel that way. It's because of our environment. But also that there are still pockets of joy. Now, is it everywhere? No, but joy is never everywhere all the time. You know, sometimes you have to look for it, but that there is joy in these experiences. And I think that's it.
Personally, I found freedom as well as joy and self-love just from not hiding. I hid for decades and it was painful.
Yes.
I think that's the thing people don't understand. And I don't know if you saw a pastor I think it was in New York, on a Sunday morning, stood up in the pulpit and announced that she was transitioning. And the quote that I read that really sticks with me is that she said, "I'm not transitioning to become a woman. I'm transitioning to no longer pretend to be a man."
Exactly.
I thought she said that so beautifully, and people don't really understand what it means to transition or what it means to find joy, like you're talking about, after suppressing and hiding for so many years. And the world is filled with people who fear any differences.
Yes.
How do we bridge that gap with people?
I think that it's hard because I wish I could give you like a really snappy, quick, like, here's
No.
what you gotta do. But
No,
No,
there is
I
that's
no,
don't.
never
there
how
is
it
no
is.
snappy quick.
There is no snappy quick because I think it's partially is a cultural change. Like what you were talking
Big
about
time.
earlier, Wendy, of like, 13 years ago, okay, no longer, psychotic. And that this can only happen through cultural change. And more acceptance can only happen through cultural change. Like when we look at other cultures who have different definitions of gender than the Eurocentric, version, there is so much variety. But
Right.
that variety only happened within a certain cultural context, right?
Exactly.
And so I think we live in a time where, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. I feel I live in a time where I can say, it could be so much better, so much better.
Right.
And the gap between where we are now and that better can seem insurmountable. And so I think focusing on cultural change in the here and now is the only way through, because I might not live to see that, how it could be better. Like that might be cultural change that happens a lot longer than me.
I've had a lot of conversations with people in the gay community where I used to live.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, they still tell me, keep doing what you're doing, keep talking to people, and those one-on-one conversations and group conversations and public conversations, that makes the difference. That begins to open the door to comprehension and a framework for acceptance. And what I envision what we're doing with our podcast is I don't particularly care to have allies. I want informed allies.
Yeah.
People who can multiply our voices to their coworkers, their families, their friends, their neighbors. That's what we need desperately.
I always find it curious whenever I talk to someone and they're like, well, I don't know any LGBTQ people in my life. I'm like, statistically, you probably do.
You really don't know that you haven't.
Right. Right. That's a good way of framing it. Yeah. You most likely you do. But maybe it just hasn't come up in conversation. Statistically, you do know somebody. And so if us having this conversation can open up those other conversations, I think that makes it all worth it.
When my ex-wife started talking to people about me, that's when she started finding out, oh yeah, well, I know someone here, or I've got a relative over there. And it just opens the doors.
And that's what happened to me when I started this podcast, started researching for it, just talking to people, and that just what Wendy said. Oh yeah, I know this person and that person. And it's amazing. I think when we're ready, things start to open up, when we're accepting and willing to take a look at things. So before we wind this up, Wolfie, is there anything that you want to tell our audience and make a point of making this world a better place?
Kind of wrapping it back with the, there is joy. You must also find joy. And what I mean when I say that is that try as much as possible to make room in your personal life for not being on your phone. And I'm only half joking because I also doom scroll. Okay. I'm not immune. I do my best to not. But in today's climate, I think it is so important that we take time to intentionally do something that makes us happy, that's not looking at all of everything that is going on in the whole world. Like I tell my clients, our brain was meant to comprehend when Jim Bob's cow down the street died, right? And the pain and suffering that brought, not to be inundated every single moment with the pain and suffering of the entire world.
Right.
And I think that wanting to know about all the pain and suffering comes from a good place. wanting to be informed, I think, comes from a good place. But I think find the line where you can draw of what you can cut out to open yourself up to more joy. Because the pain and suffering of the world is going to be there.
Always.
You know, it's not going to leave because you're not looking. But if you're looking at that, too busy looking at that and not looking for how to create joy in your life, then I think that just makes us more miserable. I'm not saying you'll be happy all the time, but just little glimpses of joy, I think, are what is important.
Yeah, I've always, along with your joy, I've always believed in being able to self-validate who you are, not looking to others for comparison about their life, their transition, what they're into, and also validate yourself as to who you are. That's more important than posting and looking to others to validate you. That's temporary. Being self-validating and self-loving is most important. And that will contribute to that joy that you talk about.
Yes. And I also want to add on to that, because I think you make a great point of, like, a lot of therapy space, we talk about dysphoria, which makes a lot of sense. And also take time to find euphoria. Absolutely. What are the things that you do where you feel like, okay, you know, me and my body, we're like on the same wavelength right now, you know, like we're doing the thing. What are things that bring you some sort of gender euphoria, right? Because if we're only just paying attention to the dysphoria, which it's there, it's a thing I think that a lot of people struggle with. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but what I'm saying is look for the other ways that, like, maybe your body does bring you joy. Like, in my moments where I feel my most dysphoric, I often think, like, wow, I'm so glad, I'm so grateful that I have feet that can carry me where I need to go when I need to walk somewhere.
Beautiful.
And that's it. You know, it doesn't have to be a huge thing, but yes, just to add on to what you were saying.
And that dysphoria is just the incongruence about how you feel about yourself and how you have to live, and the societal pressures on you. So I always encourage people to shift their beliefs, and that will start to minimize that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation, Wolfie. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks to y'all again just for having me. I had a great time.
And there's so many good reminders that we got from Wolfie today, you know, about hope and joy and not having to fully understand someone's experience, and the curiosity piece, you know, and we always talk about that curiosity, but Wolfie really brought that to the forefront today, how important that is. So on behalf of Wendy Cole and me, Lynn Murphy, thank you for joining us today in this episode of Demystifying the Transgender Journey. Remember to subscribe, like, share. We want people to be able to access this, and your likes and your shares are going to help build our audience and make this more visible so that people can learn what it's like to be on the transgender journey. So thank you again for being here. Join us next time. If you subscribe, be sure and click that little bell so that you can get notifications of when we got another one coming up. We will have another one soon. And as we always say, stay curious and stay kind. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Demystifying the Transgender Journey. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of our fascinating interviews. You can also find more information on our website, thetransgenderjourney.com. So until next time, stay curious and stay kind.